Hi, my name's Karen Miller. I'm owner and founder of Tenkara Zen Fly Fishing Gear. And today we are going to talk about the science of fly fishing. Now, I promise you, I am not a science nerd, but there is a lot of science that comes into play into fly fishing. Beyond just the obvious of etymology and biology and environment and all of that stuff. There's actually a lot of physics, geometry, and mathematics that goes into it. And I promise you, we're not going to get very technical because I am by no means a science geek. But I do want to explain it to you that there is a physics behind being a successful caster, whether it is on a fly rod or a Tenkara rod. There are certain mechanics involved. They are the same mechanics whether you're on a rod, a fly rod and reel, or a Tenkara rod without a reel. But the physics behind it is the same. So let's just sort of dive down the rabbit hole and see if this doesn't make sense to you, because what I'm hoping is if we spend a little time and give an explanation and then provide you a few visuals, the next time you pick up your fly rod or your Tenkara rod, you can think about these things, and I believe it will make sense to you. And you might even be able to straighten out a few errors that you might be making, or if you've got some bad habits or things that are happening with your line once it's cast, you might be able to dissect what's going on without having to get a casting lesson, all right? So when we think about fly fishing, right, we immediately think of fly rods. And your fly rod is simply a tool, okay? A tool, the definition of a tool is something that either stores or utilizes energy, or does a combination of both of those things. So a tool stores energy, uses energy, and your fly rod is your tool. No different than a baseball bat or a golf club, okay? Now, in order to get energy out of that tool, you need some kind of a force. A force is a weight or a mass that is accelerated either through a push or a pull, okay? Your fly line is your force, okay? Your fly line has weight and density, and when you accelerate it, it creates a force that is applied to your tool or your fly rod, okay? Causing that rod to bend. When we talk about fly lines, right, or even fly rods, we often associate them with a weight, a 2 weight, a 4 weight, a 5 weight, a 7 weight, a 10 weight, a 12 weight rod. What that number represents is a manufacturer recommendation for what size or weight of line that is needed for that rod in order for it to bend and flex appropriately. So when a manufacturer such as Winston or Orvis makes a rod and says this is our 5 weight rod, they are telling the customer that you need to put on that rod a line that weighs this much in order to get that rod to perform and bend and store energy efficiently. Okay? Fly lines, to be rated a 5-weight, a 7-weight, a 10-weight fly line, have to fall within a certain weight or grains. So a grain is a measurement. It is a very small measurement. If you think of a grain like a grain of salt, it's very small, it's very light. So a grain is 0.002 of an ounce, okay? And the industry, the fly fishing industry, says in order for a line to be called a 5-weight line, it has to fall within this range of grain weight, okay? Or this many ounces, or this percentage of an ounce, okay? So a 5-weight fly line, say a 2-foot section of 5-weight fly line, is going to weigh less and be less dense than a 1-foot section of a 10-weight fly line. The 10-weight fly line will be thicker, it will be denser, it will literally weigh more than the 5-weight fly line, okay? Does that make sense? Are you following me? So a heavier line, right, weighs more and is going to create more force upon your rod or your tool than a lighter line, okay? The lighter the line and the less of it, the less force. The more line and the more of it, the greater the force. So, again, if I take that 5-weight line and I weigh out 1 foot of that, it's going to weigh less than if I take that same 5-weight line and now weigh out 40 feet of that line and weigh it, right? There's simply more line, so it weighs more if I put it on a scale. And because it weighs more, once it's accelerated and moved through the air, it will create greater force on your tool, your fly rod, causing it to bend more, which is another term for loading the rod. Are you following? So we've got a tool that utilizes or stores energy, and that tool is your fly rod. We need a force to be applied to that tool, which is your fly line, which is a mass that has been accelerated. That accelerated mass applies a certain amount of force to your rod, causing that rod to bend, to flex, to load, okay? So in order for a fly rod to cast well, you need a force to be applied to it, which creates energy, okay? Every time that rod flexes, energy is stored in that flex point, in that bend, okay? When you accelerate that mass or that force, you're loading the rod. Loading the rod is storing energy in it. Now you have all this energy in your rod, stored in your rod. How do you get it into the line, right? Because when you transfer that energy from the rod, that flex in the rod, to the line, that is how you shoot out line, okay? You do that by stopping your fly rod. When you stop your rod during a stroke, that energy is transferred from the rod into the tip and into the line. If you don't stop your rod, you can't transfer the energy. And if you stop it kind of wishy-washy, kind of like pumping the brakes or coming to a creep, like as if you're creeping through a stop sign, right? Then you're not going to have an efficient transfer of energy. You have to slam the brakes on your fly rod in order for that transfer to occur in the most effective way. All right? So now let's talk a little bit about the parts of a cast, the actual mechanics of it, right? When people talk about the mechanics of a cast, they talk about a stroke, they talk about the stop, we just mentioned, and they talk about the arc. That can be a little confusing, and we're going to clear that up in just a second. There are also variables. There is speed, or that acceleration, right? And there's how much power you put into your cast. There's also consistency and efficiency. Those are all variables, right? Like we talked about the stop. If we have kind of a creepy slide through the stop sign, sort of a stop, you don't have an efficient transfer of energy. So your cast could be, good in every other way, but you're not effectively transferring the energy. You're losing energy by creeping through the stop sign, all right? Let's talk about the stroke. The stroke of a fly cast is that actual physical motion of moving your arm to move the rod, okay? That stroke can be really slow. It can be fast, right? So that is a variable, the speed of the stroke. The size of the stroke can also be variable, whether it's a big stroke or it's a little stroke, okay? But you need to have a stroke in order to move and accelerate that mass and create the force on your tool or your fly rod. The next part of a fly cast is the stop, which we've already spoken about. It is critical, and there are two stops. There is one in the forward cast, and then there's a stop in the back cast. Both of those stops are necessary, are critical, and must be solid stops. And then there's the arc. And a lot of people really get confused when they talk about the arc of a cast because it's associated with the stroke. And when we think and talk about a fly cast, we often talk about it in reference to the face of a clock. All of you have probably heard people refer to a casting stroke as 10 to 2, right? If you think about a clock, it's 10 o'clock on the front cast, 2 o'clock on the back cast. And when people criticize or critique rods, they'll say, oh no, you went all the way back to 3 o'clock or something along those lines, right? And then what happens is when people think about the face of a clock and 10 to 2, they think about this arc that's created if I were to, put a marker, a Sharpie in my hand and literally draw a line from 10 to 2. It would be this rounded, kind of circular formation. And people get into the habit of doing this when they cast. A stroke does not have a pivot point. In order to make this sort of arc from 10 to 2, right? The assumption is there's a pivot point that doesn't move. This is where we get people casting just from their elbow or their wrist, right? This is a locked spot that just pivots, or a locked place and only the arm pivots back and forth. This is wrong, and this is why we get these messy big loops, or people hit their fly on the back cast on the ground, their line, or their cast doesn't go out forward, it piles up in front of them. There is no pivot point. Let's look at this by actually looking at a clock. Okay. So when we look at a clock, and I'm going to share this with you if I can. There we go. Do you see this? The stroke is not from a pivot point moving the arm back and forth like a windshield wiper. Instead, the arc refers to the change in the angle on the forward cast and the back cast. So it isn't this distance up here. It's the change. This is your stroke, which is actually and should be horizontal. And the arc that you make really is more about the angle change in your rod that takes place once you've done the stroke. Okay? So a 10 to 2 stroke is a horizontal movement of the rod, keeping it straight in my arm, and the change that occurs when I'm holding that rod in my hand and pushing and pulling in a horizontal line. The size of that stroke depends. It's not a constant. So here, I have a small stroke. If I have a small line, a very light line, or a very short line, or in Tenkara a very short and very light line, my stroke has to be smaller. I'm simply not in need of as much force. Okay? Or I should say, I don't have as much force. So my stroke has to be a little faster, possibly, because I have less mass in order to load that rod, okay? A bigger rod, like a 10, 11, or a 12 weight, if I want to cast a lot of line on that rod, right? That line requires more force to bend and load it. And the farther I want to cast, the more energy I need to collect in the rod, which means I have to bend that rod more. The more I can bend that 11 or 12 weight rod, the more energy I can store in it and then transfer it to my line and make my line go farther, all right? So I might be pulling and pushing harder because I'm carrying more weight and I have to accelerate all that weight. And by double hauling and letting out more line and more line, I am flexing my rod further and further so that I can cast it farther and farther. Make sense? Okay. So remember that transfer of energy occurs only when the rod is stopped. And it becomes difficult to have that solid stop when you've got a lot of force out there, right? If you have a lot of force that you're exerting, right, on your line, you have weight, you have acceleration, it takes a lot of power to stop that rod because that line wants to keep going, okay? Those stops have to be solid. I can't say that enough. So when you're building up energy in your rod by moving your line through the air and flexing your rod to load it, you also have to be very cautious about staying horizontal in your stroke, right? Because the stroke needs to be horizontal. If I come down and up, I'm no longer being efficient. Or if I come up and cast this way, like my clock face, I'm also losing efficiency because my loop is going to, be big and open, or it's going to create a tailing end and I'm going to get it tangled. And you have to allow time for all that line to stretch out in either direction. That is the other reason for that stop, right? It's stop transfer the energy, let that line go. When that line goes, that is what is also helping that rod to bend. Okay? So, loop formation is really critical. And in order to get a clean, sexy loop that's even front to back, okay, you need to make sure your stroke is level. So, rod tip moves horizontally, not like the arc of a clock face. A narrower loop is more energy efficient. Simple as that. You're not wasting energy in all these other, formations. Energy is built by the power and speed that the tip is traveling and how solid it is stopped on both ends of the cast. The more the rod bends, the more it loads. There's that industrial, industry term. And the more it loads, the more energy is stored and ultimately can be delivered. A firm stop focuses that energy to the tip and then transfers it to the line. And your line will always follow your tip, right? So that is some law of physics. Once in motion, an object kind of will stay in motion in the same direction as it was initially sent, right? Loop shape and size shows where your rod tip traveled. If your loop is big, your tip went up. If you're having tail loops and your line or fly is getting caught in your loop and tangled, then that's called a tailing loop and you're dipping. So for efficiency's sake, so that you don't dilute the energy that you've stored in that rod, make sure your stroke is horizontal and isn't going up or down or in some other direction. A horizontal stroke with even vertical distribution, so the space between my line and where my loop forms, should create narrow, clean, efficient loops, okay? An arced or uneven horizontal stroke creates a wide, inefficient tailing loop or a loop that will tangle on itself. So always, 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 your line follows your tip, and it will tell you what you're doing wrong if you look at your loop. You can dissect it, because wherever your line goes or wherever your tip goes, your line follows, okay? So watching your cast is a great way to be able to critique what you're doing right and what might need to change or could change to improve your casting outcome. All right, so we talked about that, making sure your stroke is horizontal so that you don't lose energy. The other thing that is really critical, and it's actually something I just personally started to do, I don't know why, it's suddenly become like a little habit that when I am casting, instead of coming forward and backwards with an even stroke, I suddenly have been doing this. or this. And that little bit of twist means that my rod tip is coming out of its lane, or more technically, its plane. Okay? So if we think of a circle, right? And from this side parallel is a 180-degree circle, right? If I'm casting straight up above, I'm casting my rod along a certain plane, right? Roughly a 90-degree angle plane. If I cast this way, I'm casting along a 45-degree angle plane, or straight parallel is, maybe like completely horizontal to the surface of the water. Whatever plane I am casting in, I need to stay in it. You need to, just like a vehicle driving a car, you need to stay in your lane or your plane. Swerving out of your lane is inefficient, right? If you drove down the road like this, you are not being very efficient, okay? Right? If you had a mile stretch to drive and you walked in a straight line, okay, you would be doing a mile. But if you drove that mile going back and forth like this, swerving in your lane, you would end up doing more than a mile, right? The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That's somebody's law, Archimedes of Syracuse or somebody. But it is a law of physics. Shortest distance between straight lines, or between 2 points, is a straight line. So be efficient. Don't waste your energy swerving around. And if you're going to do a cast and you're going to be swerving, not only are you potentially losing some energy in that cast, but remember, where your rod tip goes, your line follows. So if I curve and bring my rod tip around, guess what? My line is gonna swerve and come around. And my fly will end up over here, not straight in front of me where I probably intended it to go. So, casting along a singular plane is critical and efficient. Swerving or drifting, we call, results in lost or unfocused energy. Where your rod tip goes, your line follows, right? So we want to make sure we're not drifting up or down or side to side in our cast, but almost like we have, 2 walls and our arm has to stay in between those 2 walls. All right. Any questions so far? You can comment down below and I will do my best, even though I'm not a science teacher, to answer and respond to them. All right. So I'm going to ask you a question that I want you to think about. It's becoming a little bit of a trend now in fly fishing. People overloading their rod, meaning they might have a 5 or 7 weight rod, and on that 5 weight rod, they're putting a 6 weight line. Or they have a 7 weight rod and they're putting on an 8 weight line. Why are people doing that? Or why would some anglers choose to do that? Particularly in the bigger rod sizes. So the 8 weights, the 9 weights, the 10 weights, the 11 and the 12s. What would be the advantage of overloading your rod, putting a bigger line on that rod than what the manufacturer is actually calling for? So I have a 10 weight rod and I put an 11 weight line on that rod. What would be the benefit for me to do that? I want to hear back from you and see if you can answer that question. All right. I think that's it for now. We'll go on and talk about fish management and our fishing triangle in the next video. Thanks so much for listening. The science of fly fishing. I'm sure there's science people out there, teachers. If I didn't get it completely right, please excuse me. That is not my area of specialty, but I think I mostly got it right. And if you have any bits of helpful information to help explain this, please put them in our comments. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Tight lines and happy fishing to you.